Let's talk about exposure values for this new week of work, where we specifically want to use the photographic triangle to maximize any given point of the triangle for getting an exposure value. Again, an exposure value just means half as much light or twice as much light. So plus 1 EV equals you doubled the light, and minus 1 EV means you cut the light in half. Now these three attributes, your shutter speed or exposure time, your aperture, and your ISO, all affect your exposure value in a different way. Now I currently have this set so that I can go up or down 4 stops in these various things, or 4 exposure values. Those terms are interchangeable. And in each case, I won't hit the maximum. Again, I'm using a 6D, but you guys are on T3Is. So it's important to know that your ISO has a maximum of, I think, 6400. And so I'm trying to compensate for that, knowing that I need 4 exposure values up. So 400, go to 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. In other words, for those 4 stops, 400 is where we need to be to maximize that. And again, I'm also using an f4 as my lowest aperture. And the reason for that is because a lot of lenses don't go below that. A lot of lenses have a maximum aperture of 5.6. So this will mean that we don't have to use math that might not be available to you because your lens can't get that. So this first photo is going to use the aperture to determine an exposure value. I set this here, and then with my ISO of 400, because I need to double it every time, I just set my exposure time to 1/40th based on my viewfinder and what it told me. So I don't know if you can see in there, but if you hold it down halfway, it should give you a green line that says what's going to happen. So if I look through here and I hold the shutter button halfway down, there's a little chart that tells you if you are properly exposed. It'll also tell you if you're underexposed or overexposed. So right now with 1/40th, this little scene that I have set up is perfectly exposed. So I'm going to do some quick punching in front of this, and you can see the motion blur. It's on a 10-second timer. Now let's see what that image looks like. So notice that the depth of field has a lot of blur, but there's not a lot of motion blur on me. The cabinets in the back are very blurry, whereas the tissue box is in focus and therefore looks pretty good. Hit play to get out of that, and now we can adjust these settings more. If you're looking through the viewfinder to set these things, and again I recommend that because using this display screen actually eats your battery a lot. The way that you can adjust your aperture is by holding down the AV button that's right here on T3S. Again, I'm using a different model than you. There's an AV button here, not to be confused with the AV mode that's on top of this dial here. And while the AV button is held down halfway, use your little scroll wheel here to adjust your aperture. Aperture again is the weird one where a lower number means more exposure. So now we need to go up 4 exposure values from f4. Now there's a couple ways we can do this. One is you can actually look up a chart like this one and notice that this tells you the exposure value or f number and what it takes to go up a stop. So from 4 stops up is 5.6, 8, 11, 16. And when you use your scroll wheel to adjust these things, it'll tell you by being 3 clicks for 1 exposure value. So from f4 to 5.6, that should be 3 clicks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 3 clicks per exposure value equals 12 clicks to go up 4 exposure values. And look at that, the numbers are the same, f16. Exactly what we wanted. So since we've gone 4 exposure values darker for aperture, we need to go 4 exposure values lighter for exposure time. So the way you calculate exposure time is just double or halve the number of seconds. So we're at 1/40th of a second. So twice as much time would be 1/20th of a second, then 1/10 of a second, then 1/5 of a second, and then roughly 1/2 of a second. So let's test that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 2 exposure values. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 4 exposure values. And approximately 0 seconds and 0.5 seconds. So let's see if this takes an equal exposure. Hitting the shutter button. I'm going over to body, make sure I have motion blur. What kind of image did that give us? Lots and lots of motion blur. But compare that motion blur to the depth of field blur. The background is really, really crisp in comparison to this tissue box. And yet, if we compare it to the previous photo, they're equally exposed. So we've kept our exposure value from one to the other identical by modifying different points of the photographic triangle. And by the way, if you ever want to know what settings you used for one of these photos, you can hit Info, and it'll bring it up. You can actually toggle through multiple things. Alright, so now that we've seen that, let's work on the last one, which is your ISO. ISO is how sensitive the camera sensor is to your exposure. And it's generally the last one you want to modify. For as much time as possible, I try and shoot on ISO at 200 or 100 for outdoor scenes because there's lots and lots of light. And then somewhere around 1600 for indoor scenes. So now we're going to go 4 stops or exposure values darker for my exposure time, and therefore 4 stops lighter for ISO. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Back where we started. 4 stops up. We're keeping our aperture the same, so both our shutter speed and our aperture are dark compared to the previous 2 photos that we've taken. And now we have to compensate by making our ISO 4 stops lighter. Now how does ISO work? You just double or halve it to go up and down 1 exposure value. So to go down an exposure value, we could go to 200. To go up 1 exposure value, we're going to go to 800. It's either divide by 2 or cut in half, or times by 2. And again, if you're wanting to use this using the viewfinder, if you hold down this ISO button or toggle it, that lets you change it from in there if you have your shutter button. So you can set it. Okay, let's go up 4 stops of exposure using our ISO. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And that's probably the maximum ISO on your eyes, I believe. Alright, let's take that photo and see what we get. Going over to do motion blur. Trying to keep motion available. Not a lot of motion blur. There's still a little bit, but compare it to that one, there's a lot of motion blur. And aperture-wise, we have simultaneously a crisp background and a crisp subject who is doing action. However, if we zoomed in on this, we're not going to be able to on this display very well, but if we zoomed in on this in Photoshop, there's going to be more noise here because we're just telling the sensor to gather more data, and as a result, it kind of gathers worse data. Now let's play on hard mode and actually go down 4 stops on our ISO, back to 400. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's 4 exposure values down in ISO, or 4 stops, as it's also known. Now, what if I did something? Wait, pardon me, I'm doing this wrong. I meant to go 4 stops up. Never mind, back at 6400. So what if we went 4 stops even lighter by going, say, 4 stops down on our F stop? Or perhaps we could do 2 stops on, or 2 exposure values through aperture and 2 with this. So F8 is 2 stops down from the F16 that we previously shot, right? Yep. So let's go down 2 stops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, And let's go down, or let's go brighter by 2 stops or 2 exposure values on exposure time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now why would I do that? This would make an image that has 4 stops more light than our previous examples. Well, there's something called a neutral density filter, and it's just an example of all the ways that you can adjust your images. This neutral density filter, you'll notice, says ND16 on it. And if you Google that, it'll tell you on Wikipedia that that equates to 4 exposure values darker. So right now, we're 4 exposure values too high. But if I take this picture with the ND filter right in front of it, or neutral density filter, it should end up being an exposure value that's identical to the previous 2. Now this is from an older lens that I no longer have, so I can't screw it on. Normally you'd want that. But I can still hold it in front and we'll probably get a perfectly exposed image. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can see a little bit of my finger there, but compare its exposures. There's with the finger, there's with ISO, there's with shutter speed, and there's with aperture. With aperture we have a blurred background, but very little motion blur. With shutter speed we have lots of motion blur, but both the background and the foreground are in focus. With ISO we have less motion blur. There's still a little bit because we're at 1/40th of a second. But we have neither motion blur or depth of field blur. However, we would have noise if we zoomed in on that. And we have a neutral density filter, which you guys aren't required to do, but it's still mathematically mapped out to match these exposure value ideas. Hope that helps.